pulled up to make sure there's no questions there. All right. So tonight we are so thrilled to have a fantasy YA panel with Maxine Kaplan and Django Wexler. Maxine is here for her standalone novel, Wench, and Django is here for the third book in his trilogy. Wrong way. I'm flipped on the screen.
Do that all the time.
Siege of Rage and Ruin is the last one, but the whole trilogy is fantastic. It really does need to be read in order. So you're going to want to start with Ship of Smoke and Steel. There's too much alliteration there for me to remember the titles.
We worked really hard to come up with alliterative titles.
I love them. I'm a huge fan of alliteration, but the words get all scrambled in my brain when I'm not looking at them. And they are very different feeling fantasies, but they are both a whole lot of fun. So we are super excited to have them partnered up tonight. So I'm going to give more formal introductions of each of them. Maxine Kaplan studied English and political science at Oberlin College and held a variety of positions in the publishing world before landing her current job as a private investigator and author, which I think she's going to have to tell us a bit about. She lives and writes in Brooklyn.
I'm a dream killer. It's not as cool as it sounds.
She lives and writes in Brooklyn, where she caters to the whims of her dim-witted but soulful cat, who may or may not be popping up on your screen at some point during this, I've been told. So I'm going to let her tell you a little bit about Wench.
Thank you. I am so excited to be here. This is so much fun, and I'm so excited to be on a panel with Django. Wench follows the archetypal tavern wench stock character that you find in so many tabletop role-playing games and classic sword and sorcery fantasy, and it sends her off on her own adventure. When she loses her inn due to a bureaucratic error, she goes on a quest to petition the queen and council to get the rights to her inn back, and along the way she meets some very unscrupulous soldiers, some very cute thieves, and finds a mysterious magical artifact of feather that seems to like her, and learns how to use it in a kind of unlikely twist that it can only work for somebody very, very organized. So it's got a lot of chaotic magic. It basically takes the idea of what happens when there's a new magic system that nobody understands how to use, and how chaos can drive a fantasy epic in that context. And also my first novel, Accidental Bad Girl, which is a noir, it's not a fantasy, came out in paperback this month, and it's very pretty. So holding that up too.
Thank you, Maxine. We're so glad to have you here this evening. And then Django Wexler is a self-proclaimed computer fantasy sci-fi geek. He graduated from Carnegie Mellon University with degrees in creative writing and computer science, worked in artificial intelligence research and as a programmer and writer for Microsoft, and is now a full-time fantasy writer. Django is the author of The Shadow Campaigns, an epic fantasy series for adults published by Rock, and The Forbidden Library, a classic fantasy series for young readers published by Kathy Dawson Books, and then obviously the Wells of Sorcery trilogy, which is what he is here for this evening. So Django, if you'll tell us a little bit about Wells of Sorcery.
It's a little hard to explain the plot of the book that came out without giving a ton of spoilers, but the start of the books, back in Ship of Smoke and Steel, is that we have our protagonist Issaka is a gang enforcer, basically, whose job it is to sort of keep order on the streets, and she has a type of magic that's forbidden, sort of combat fighting magic to do that. And she's drafted by her government and blackmailed into going to try to take over a famous ghost ship that sails around the seas and is faster and bigger than anything anyone has ever built, and no one has ever come back alive. And so they sent her out on this sort of suicide mission, and she boards the ship and finds out that the people who live on it have this kind of Lord of the Flies society going on there. She has to kind of work her way up through that, and then also, maybe become a better person, because the trip makes it clear to her that the way she's been living is not a great one. And then, sorry, the timing on these, I'm always like, is someone about to talk? I should stop talking. And then in books 2 and 3, we sort of continue this story, but we also get the perspective of Issaka's younger sister, Tori, who stays behind And when she discovers that her older sister has been dragooned by the government into this apparent suicide mission, she ends up starting a revolution against the government, which by the time the third book starts has broken out, and so comes back and discovers that things are not quite where she left them.
Okay, and you guys, I've read all these books and they're fabulous. Just for the record, I refuse to host an event where I haven't read the books. And with Django's, I really intended to just read the first one because of time, and could not stop. So just like bear that in mind when making your choices about buying books. Cannot stop. Wench was the same way, and I'm actually a little disappointed, Maxine, that there's not going to be a follow-up as far
Well,
as
you
I
never
can
know.
tell.
I mean, I have lots. I mean, I deliberately left open a lot of doors at the end, and not to get too much into it, but one thing that I do like to do in writing fantasy, or at least I've decided I like to do since I haven't written a huge amount of fantasy yet, although I love it, is I like to leave some mysteries that are about how the world works, and so there's lots of things to explore, and I have ideas about other stories. So we'll see. Right now, there's no plans, but we'll see.
I like that there's a possibility. I will take that.
I definitely left open the option.
But it did feel complete, just in case anyone's nervous about that. It's not that it doesn't feel like a complete story in itself, but she did leave some things at the end where you're like, there could be more. So I guess I want to start with talking about how you come up with your magical systems, right? Because I am new-ish to magical fantasy. I'm not like a diehard magical fantasy reader, but I've had the opportunity to do some other panels with the magical systems in them. And so I've been reading more of it recently. And I hadn't put a lot of thought prior to that into like how different like the whole magical world, and there are rules that you have to come up with while you are writing or before you are writing. And how does that work for you?
Do you want to go first or should I?
Why don't you go first?
So for me, I tend to start with the story, with the characters and the sort of basic plot I want to happen. And that sort of puts some constraints on what the magic can be, right? So for example, in this series, in Wells of Sorcery, I knew the magic had to be something that was inborn and something that you could learn to use fairly quickly, since this is a YA and all our main characters are teenagers. So it's no good having a magic system that you have to study for 50 years to use if the plot is going to be people having magical battles, which is what the plot kind of is. The other example I like to use is in my adult series, the Shadow Campaigns is a military fantasy. So it's a sort of Napoleonic wars setting, and there's all these, musketry and cannons and cavalry charges. And for that book, I knew I needed the magic system to not be a kind of slam bang D&D type magic system, a sort of Wheel of Time or Malazan Book of the Fallen magic system, because if wizards can wave a hand and destroy 1,000 men, then the whole military army thing becomes a little pointless. And so the magic is much more subtle. So the first constraint is always, what is the story going to be, and how can you set up the magic system to kind of support that? And then the other way I come at it is through the world building. So in Ship of Smoke and Steel, people are born with these magical powers, with access to one of these 9 wells, which each have a different type of magical power. And every society in this world has to deal with that. You have to deal with the fact that people are born with kind of intrinsic magical ability that can be extremely dangerous. And so you either have to co-opt it. If you're a ruling class, you have to make sure it's just you, or you have to imprison these people, or you have to make them a sacred warrior caste or something. And one of the fun things about these books is that because this ghost ship roves around the world, we get to meet people from a bunch of different societies, and they all kind of handle it differently. So in one society, everybody with magic gets inducted into the army and they're all slaves. And in another society, the people with magic are the blessed of the gods and they rule everything. But everyone has to deal with it somehow. And so sort of building the magic system into the world building in that way is the sort of other way to come at it for me.
That's really interesting. For me, for Wench, I started with a I started with the feather, really, which is this feather quill that Tanya, my main character, comes across early in her adventures, and I wanted it to kind of work like a 3D printer. Like I wanted it to be like you can move elements around. And then, being a deep lover of fantasy, one of the things that I know is almost an article of faith among lots of people who write fantasy is that where there is magic, there has to be a cost. And as I started to think about that, I started to really think along the lines of the real world industrial revolution, and how and what the effects of that kind of magic would be, more than the rules of the magic. And I became really interested in what the cost of the magic would be. In the book, I call it junk off. And it's kind of random. You can, raise a wind to set a ship a sail, and then somewhere else cotton will start falling from the sky. As long as it's sort of elemental and can be considered equal and opposite, it's sort of up to nature where the effects come from. And the way I thought of it was, when we started using coal, we had no idea what effects that would have on society or on the environment. Same with steam engines, and it completely overturned the entire society. And I wanted to catch my magic system at kind of its nascent period, because that's something that I don't really see that often in fantasy. And I find it kind of fascinating to think, what does a magic system look like if people are still figuring out how to use it? If it doesn't take more than just a little bit of innate scale, something that approximates a wand, and the ability to want to try, how does that affect the world? How many people are going to use magic? How are they going to use it differently? How does it become more dangerous? How does it in some ways become even less dangerous if it's not so regimented, if it's kind of chaotic? And so I really built more chaos into my magic system than I see a lot, and partially that's a function of my personality, because I am very unlike my protagonist Tanya, in that I am a supremely disorganized person. I'm the girl who had, mandatory backpack checks from various teachers, and my locker was taken for lost and found for literally 6 months, like, because I lost the combination lock, obviously, and people just used it as a lost and found. That's an actual true story. So I kind of wanted the chaos, the unknown of the magic, to drive the story a little bit. And then obviously there's going to be people who, as you were saying, Django, there's going to be people who are going to seize the power in that and want to regiment it and want to dole it out and want to be in charge of who gets to use it. So those are the kinds of things that I think about when devising a magic system. And then, as the way I just write it is, honestly, I kind of just draft, and then I go through and think, all right, I didn't explain that. I didn't think that. I didn't explain that. I didn't explain that. I want to explain that. I want to explain that. I want that to be mysterious, and kind of cobble it together from there, which is how I imagine it would actually happen if we somehow discovered a way to use magic. It wouldn't spring forth from nature with a fully delineated structure of these kinds of magic users can do this and these kinds of magic users can do this. It would be much more experimental. And while I love those really regimented magic systems, and I think they're fascinating, and I'm so in awe of people who can create worlds that are that intricate, in the case of Wench, I wanted there to be a little bit more wildness involved.
The thing that I have often heard said, it's often attributed to Brandon Sanderson, is that there are different types of magic systems for different types of stories. That if you're writing a highly regimented magic system, then the magic becomes like a tool in the toolbox of these characters. Yes. And it's like, when you're watching a cop show, the basics of, what they can do. They can do fingerprints, they can do DNA tests, they can, whatever, run camera records, car records, whatever. I'm not a cop show person, you probably tell. And so if you're writing a story where people are going to be doing that kind of procedural stuff, then you need a more regimented system. Whereas if you're not, if the protagonists of the story don't interact with it it's not something that they understand so well, then that regimentation is actually harmful because it makes the magic feel sort of tame in a way that it
Yeah.
probably shouldn't.
Sometimes, and I love that quote. I hadn't heard that before, but I love that. That's really smart, because sometimes, and this is no shade on any particular series, but sometimes magic systems can feel very prescriptive,
Mm-hmm.
and that again is fascinating. And when you're like thinking about it from an anthropological point of view, and like what's how societies have evolved to do that, but it can sometimes, as a story engine, for me, not be quite as exciting
Mm-hmm.
as what's a little bit more, trying to think of the word, a little more chaotic, I guess.
Yeah, it's all down to like what kind of story you're trying to tell.
Yeah, it's a very good point.
And sort of on that same note, Django, I know you've written for all age levels, but what drew
I
Hmm?
guess I have now.
But what drew you guys to YA specifically for these, at least?
Um, well, for me, I what I wanted to do with Wench was partially send up, partially homage, and partially deconstruct the kind of epic quest. And for me, the epic quest is inherently a coming of age story. It's inherently YA. And YA to me, and I mean, you're going to see people with a lot of different opinions on this, so maybe this is a hot take, I don't know. But for me, that's sort of what makes YA. I mean, YA, one thing that I love about it from a marketplace point of view is that it's so elastic. Like you can mash up all of these crazy elements and put it in one story, and the people who read YA will be like, excellent, that sounds fantastic, you know? And I feel like you're not able to do that when you're explicitly writing for adults for some reason. I don't know why, but it's just a little bit more siloed off from each other, all the different genres and all the different tones and even all the different POVs. Like there's something very, again, wild and chaotic about YA that I love, and particularly for like an epic quest, it didn't make sense to me to do what I was trying to do with Wench in a way that didn't foreground coming of age, that didn't foreground you go through a journey and you learn something about yourself. You know, I try not to be too didactic, because also I have zero answers about anything, but it just it lent itself to that very well for me.
For me, it was after I finished. I mean, basically, I was writing these Shadow Campaigns books, which are these sort of big, fat adult fantasies, and they take a while. And I really liked the schedule I had when I was working on the Forbidden Library books, which are much shorter. They're middle grade books, and it's 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 like I'd start writing the Forbidden Library book, and at about the time when if I had been writing one of the big adult books, I would be getting sick of it. I'm like, oh, it's done. I finished. It's only 70,000 words. This is great. So I finished that series, and I was talking to my agent, and he's like, well, why don't you do a YA? That sounds fun, and you can sort of keep up this sum of each schedule. And so we did that. And I'm one of these like, people are like, what's your next idea? And I'm like, I have so many, so I have this file of ideas that's like pages and pages and pages. And so I went through and I picked out a bunch of things that I thought would work as YA. And this is kind of the one we ended up going with. But it was just an experiment, essentially. I wanted to try a new genre. It was great because it opened my eyes to the fact that YA is good now. Basically like, showing my age here, but when I was a kid, the joke I always make is that for, kids' books, we had long series written by hack writers like the Hardy Boys and, the Boxcar Children, and then Newbery Award-winning books about dead dogs. And that was it. That was all we had. And this is obviously before Harry Potter and before the whole YA revolution, but I hadn't paid that much attention to that space. And so I asked some friends of mine, I'm like, okay, I need like a YA primer, like give me what's good. And like, man, It's a lot better. It's like so good now. And so I was like, oh, okay, this is definitely, yeah, like I, I feel like, what's the word here? I don't want to be like, this is something I can contribute to, because it's more like I can follow behind in this space. There's some really amazing stuff. Um, Leigh Bardugo's Six of Crows was a huge eye opener for me. I love that book. It's probably my favorite of the reading list of YA books and what I've gone through since. And that definitely sort of informed what I did about it.
That book's great. That whole series is great.
Yeah. I mean, really, I'm excited.
So that brings up an interesting point. I assume you guys are also readers, although I know middle of a project reading is not necessarily the priority. And Django, you kind of covered this already with but do you read what you're writing before you write it, while you're writing it? Do you try to avoid reading similar books while you're in the process of writing? Where are you at? I know different authors have different takes on that.
There are certain types of books I try to avoid while I'm writing. It's less about what I'm writing and more about the strength of the voice in the book. There are certain authors I know, if I'll read them, their voice will infect mine and I will start doing a bad parody of them. Neil Stephenson is like that, or like, P.G. Wodehouse or something. And then also, just from a very technical point of view, if I read a book that's a really strong first person or present tense, when I'm trying to do the opposite of that in third person or past tense, I just keep making mistakes because I start thinking in the book's tones, or vice versa. So I try to it's less about is it YA or adult, and more about okay, this is a third person past. So the sentences are constructed in the same way that I construct them for my book. And I'm not going to accidentally start writing, I go to the store.
Yeah, I don't really read the kinds of things that I'm writing while I'm writing it. Because for the same reason, I am worried that it's going to infect my tone. But by the same token, when I'm still formulating an idea of what I want to work on, I will sort of not really read books that are like it, but read books that make me feel I'll reread. I'll reread books that make me feel the way that the vibe that I'm thinking that I want for the book that I'm reading. So before I started writing Wench, before I started drafting it, I reread a bunch of Terry Pratchett, which, you can't emulate Terry Pratchett. That's one thing I wasn't worried about. I wasn't worried I was going to start writing like Terry Pratchett, because that would be a literal dream come true. So if Terry Pratchett can rub off on me, I'm all for it. But that's a good example of, I wanted that vibe when I started writing The Accidental Bad Girl, which is a kind of deconstruction of noir. I read Ian Fleming books and Raymond Chandler and stuff like that. It's just sort of to get me in the mood to write it more than anything else. So it's kind of a yes and no answer.
Okay. And while we're sort of talking about the writing process, so Maxine, private investigator, day job.
Yep.
So not that exciting, it turns out.
I will dispel this right away. I don't do the kind of private investigation work that you're probably imagining. I don't.
Do you at least have one of the hats?
I do not have a hat. I do not have a trench coat. I don't follow philandering husbands. I don't track down runaway teens. It's mostly a lot of corporate type investigations and some background checks and stuff like that. So sometimes, very occasionally, you run into something that feels like you're ooh, this is a private investigator moment. I found something interesting. But a lot of it is really just doing the grunt work of tracking down information, which basically boils down to a lot of research and a lot of phone calls. And so it's, I do lie to people over the phone quite a lot. That's something I do basically every day of my life. just totally allowed, by the way. It's called pretexts. You're allowed to do it. But yeah, that's so it's
Good to know.
basically a lot of research, a lot of databases, and lying to people over the phone and then writing reports. So there's it's good training in some ways because now I've been doing it for so long now that whenever I have a question about something, like just a question occurs to me in the day, I'm like, oh, I will find that out now. And I just do it. And I feel like, and it's something anyone can do. Like research is a skill like anything else. You can practice it and get better at it, but it's something that's sort of innate to me now in a way that feels very valuable.
Yeah, that sounds.
So then how that kind of segues into the writing process is like, what does your writing process look like around that day job? And Django, you're a full-time writer. So what does your writing process look like?
Go ahead.
Oh, I mean, I mostly write at night. As we were talking about a little bit before we went live on this, since working from home during the pandemic, because everybody has, little bits of spare time in their day, I've been utilizing that a little bit more for writing stuff than I think I would, than I know that I would have if I was in my office, because it's just impossible to do that if you're in an office. But, I take half an hour to eat. I can do a little bit of work while I'm doing that sometimes, but that's few and far between because I do get very busy during my day job. So most of my writing takes place between the hours of like 6 and 9. And I just try and do a little bit. I'm a big believer in setting very, very easy goals, very achievable goals. Um, 500, if I'm drafting 500 words a day, like that's just, that, and usually end up writing more than that, but just having that be like, if I just get to this, I can stop and, watch TV. Just doing a little bit every day and not expecting it to be good. You can't fix what you don't write is my motto.
It's always fascinating to me. Everyone has a different process. And so when people ask about process, I always tell them like, it's so personal. I know people who swear by writing every day. That's definitely me. But my wife, who's also a writer, she writes only on weekends. But on a given 2-day weekend, she produces as much as I do in a week. So it kind of evens out. But, everybody has their own different thing. So, if you're watching this, don't take any of it as like, this is the way. It's always personal. For me, I used to write in the mornings back when I was working in software because I found that I was just too wiped out after work. I just didn't have any energy left. And so I would get up early, even though that's very against my natural tendencies, and do an hour of writing before I left for work. And then at least, at the end of the day, I could come home and be like, all right, I did my thing for today. I can veg out and play games or watch TV or whatever. Nowadays, I'm in a sort of more natural schedule for me, which is to wake up at about 10. That's not true anymore. I've cut it back a little bit. But usually in the morning, I do administrative stuff and answer emails and so on. And then after lunch, I do some writing, and then I go for a walk or do exercise, and then I do some more writing, and then it's dinner time. So that's my typical day in pandemic land. Really, it was true before pandemic land. My wife and I have joked. She also works from home when in her day job, and so we joked we were the most prepared people for this because like it changed our routine like not at all. We don't leave the house anyway ever.
It's very
But yeah, that's my writing thing. And I also do, like you said, I work to word counts usually, depending on deadlines and other scheduling. Sometimes I have to be harder on myself than others.
And in terms of what you were saying before about like it's so personal, your writing process, it also is a very much a moving target. I have found that
each book can be different, or each part of a book can be different sometimes. Or editing and writing are very different.
Yeah, and especially if you're moving between genres or formats. I'm experimenting right now with writing a screenplay, and I'm starting to revise it, and I'm looking at it and I'm like, I don't actually functionally know how to revise this.
I wouldn't know where to start.
Well, and that is kind of a good segue into what are you working on next, if you're allowed to talk about it. I know sometimes projects are not allowed to be talked about, but
I'm working on a few different things, and I'm not sure what's going to be out in the world first yet. That I can't talk about right now. But yeah, I mean, I'm working on a. I have, like Django, I suffer from too many ideas. I have like a list that I'm just going to be checking off for a decade probably at this point. Um, but yeah, I'd say right now I'm working on sort of a lower YA, upper middle grade. I'm working on an adult project, and I'm working on this screenplay. So I'm kind of shuffling in between a bunch of them. When you launch a book, you're sort of like, where is my brain now? And I'm just gonna shuffle between these until one of them is good enough.
I have a bunch of stuff coming out actually. So I had my new adult fantasy series, starting with Ashes of the Sun, started last July, and so the next one of those comes out in October, and I'm currently finishing that up. Then I have a novella from Tor.com called Hard Reboot, which started as uh, we did this anthology called Silk and Steel, which is a
Oh
Princess X Swordswoman short story anthology inspired by a Twitter thread. It's a long and strange story, but it came to pass thanks to the magic of Kickstarter and Twitter and all these, thousands of enthusiastic people. And so I had to write a story for it. And I was really excited about this idea, and I started writing it. And I finished it, and I was like, oh, this is really great. But it was like 33,000 words long for a 7,500 word target. So I ended up writing a different story for the anthology, and this one is coming out independently as a novella. So I'm really excited about that. That comes out in May. But yeah, right now I'm working on Blood of the Chosen, which is Ashes 2, and that'll be out in October. And then I have to write book 3 of that, and there's probably a new project that I can't talk about somewhere in there.
yeah, I don't know how you guys keep all that straight. Like I don't. I'm a one book at a time I cannot even read more than one book at a time, so I cannot imagine working on writing more than one at a time.
That's another process thing. I oh, go ahead. I try to work on only one project at a time. So it's usually like, okay, draft this book, throw it over the wall to the editor, work on something else. Okay, this one came back. Okay, now we're doing the editing, throw it back. Okay, now I'm working on a different thing. But I know some people who have 4 projects open. Maxine, it sounds like that's you, right?
I mean, and that's not my usual thing, honestly. But I was in one of those positions where like this was with one person getting notes, this was in this place, this was in this place, and so while I was waiting for other things, I moved on so I wouldn't, feel the crushing weight of inertia on my back.
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time thinking about the order in which I'm going to do things. Like that's almost as big of a like I consider that a writing task, is coming up with a list in like even within a single project, the order in which I do things is something I end up
Do you also then not just do it sequentially?
No, I do, but like when I'm like when I'm drafting, I just draft. When I'm drafting a project, that is all I do, is just that. But that only is part of it for like that's like step A of of a writing project. So once you get past that, you kind of have to be like, so I'm gonna do the pass where I look at the voice now, or I'm gonna fix this scene, and like that I do out of order because honestly, I end up reordering the plot of my books quite frequently. That seems to be my process. I at this point is I write something, figure out the pacing is messed up, and then I take the back half of the book, plunk it in the middle, and completely rewrite the last section. And that appears to be my process at this point.
As long as it produces a result, whatever it is, it works.
Okay, so I know for you guys, by the time these books come out, you have been done with them for kind of a while. I'm not sure if all the attendees necessarily know that, but authors are done with books for a while before they actually get printed. But I'm wondering how you feel about that when it's done, because like, here's where I was at with both of your books. I had to take a break from reading when I finished book 3, so Django series, I read compulsively until I was done. But then once I was done, I had to take a break for a day. And I had the same experience with Wench because your worlds are so beautiful and I didn't want to move on. Do you know what I mean? I know you probably do because you're readers too. You have read things like that. But I felt that way with both of these. And I just wonder if there's a similar authorial thing where when you finish something, you need a break. I know you don't have much chance for a break, but do you have to take a break when you're leaving one world and entering the next one? Do you want to take a break?
I'm trying to take fewer breaks. I think it's important to give myself, few days a week in between like each phase of a project, but I'm trying to. I have found, especially this year, that when I don't keep my brain occupied with something, I start to, I don't know, I start to get very, very anxious, um, that like I will never write again. And as we said, like I do have a list of things that I ostensibly want to write. So anytime I'm not, I get this very like I am wasting time, like clutching feeling of anxiety in my chest. So but at the same time, like the book that you finish does, like I find that I do that it does stay, it has stayed with me in the months since I turned it in, where I'm, because you're just at that point you're just anxious. It's more externalized in a way where you're like, other people will read this now and interact with it. And I wrote Wench in a very tumultuous period in my life, so but now that it's out, I'm sort of like, I don't know what's in this book. Like I was I was talking to some other writer friends, and I was like, I'm not totally sure.
Well, especially if you've done a ton of revisions.
Yeah, I'm like,
and
I'm
you're
not.
like, did I put that in? Did I take it out?
Yeah.
I don't even remember.
Because I did end up having to cut a lot of it. Because I mean, I was writing it very much. I'm a very much of an epic fantasy reader. When you mentioned the Malazan books, I was like, oh god, that was this is the Erickson books.
Yeah.
Year of my life gone to those. So I had to I ended up cutting about 30% out of Wench ultimately.
Wow.
So my brain is sort of like, I wonder if there's like blank spaces in my brain that are like, think that that's in the book and it's not, or I've forgotten was in the book. I should probably reread it is really what I'm saying. But
for me, the starting a book is the fun part. Brainstorming and outlining and getting started on it is where I'm having the most fun. Often, like, the middle of the draft is kind of a down point. It picks up towards the end of the draft. But then I really don't like editing. It's, I do it because it makes my books better, but I don't enjoy it. And so I don't take breaks because for me, going on to the next book is the break. That's what I've been wanting to do all this time. I often joke that I'm like the dog from Up towards the end of a book, where it's like you're doing a thing and then squirrel. And I have to like drag myself, like, no, you got to finish the thing that you're on before moving on to the next project. And so for me, like when I finally turn that edit in, the reward is I get to go work on some blue sky thing now that, I haven't done any work on. Because it's when you're mapping out the broad details, that's just like, it's fun. And then the more constrained you get, the more it feels like, oh God, this is a house of cards. And if I change it too much, it may all fall apart. That's me anyway.
So one of the things, okay, so I love that both of your books feature like strong female characters. And part of that is like teen me, right? YA was not the fabulous space it is today when I was a teenager either. I don't really remember YA even being a thing. I'm sure there was some, but
pockets of good. There were pockets of good even when, I mean, I'm assuming we're roughly the same age, and there were pockets of good even then, but it was very, it was invitation to the game and Interstellar Pig and like kind of nothing else around.
Yeah, YA didn't really exist in its modern sort of like form as a marketing category prior to Harry Potter, basically. that like there wasn't just this vast universe of books aimed at older teens. It's odd. There are books now that are categorized as YA that were not written to be YA because it didn't exist at the time.
I always say that if Carrie came out today, that would have been shelved in YA.
Or like the Tamara Pierce books were just in with adult fantasy when I was a kid.
Even like things that are considered classics of YA now, the Megan McCafferty books, at the time they were published by Riverhead. They weren't shelved in YA.
Right. And so that just the notion of what is a YA book has just changed dramatically.
That is true. But when I was that age, there was a lot of like love triangle, right? Like even in the fantasy, it was like really, there was all this stuff going on, but if it was a female main character, her major struggle was picking which boy. So it made my heart really happy that that was not the case. Although I also love that there were romantic storylines in both of your books, but that wasn't the center point of what made these strong female characters. So can we talk a little bit about how your heroines came to be?
I have a lot to say about that actually, because I went through a big evolution with the romance in Wench, because I had this secret mission that I held very deep in my heart that I didn't want there to be any romance in Wench at all. I was absolutely committed to the idea of getting Tanya through like one entire epic quest with absolutely no interference or influence from a romantic interest, and then the characters that she does become involved with just showed up on the page. And I mean, I could psychoanalyze myself about it. I'm not going to do that here, but it got to the point where me not actually going into the romance was rendering the book legitimately confusing for anybody reading it, because the chemistry was on the page so clearly. So I have a lot of feelings about that, but Tanya was important to me to be the lead because I'd never seen a lead that I felt like I could relate to in epic fantasy, because most of the time it's somebody who's, very beautiful, royal in their blood, epically gifted at magic, like somehow special, somehow chosen. And I always felt like I have no skills that would be helpful on an epic quest. I couldn't fight, I couldn't do magic, I couldn't do any of that, but I had certain like competencies, and I really wanted to delve into the kind of competencies that you don't usually see in fantasy. So Tanya is very organized, she's hyper competent, very independent, and she can cook, she can clean, she can like read the room, she can sew, she can do all these things that you need to have on an epic quest. Somebody is cooking all of these epic feasts, but you never see their side of it. So I really wanted her to, I wanted her strengths to be strengths. And obviously she has a ton of weaknesses. And that's what the book's really about. It's about her discovering that she has weaknesses.
For me, the romance was a pretty central element of the book from the start, because our protagonist, it's kind of the trigger for her sort of personal journey on these books, her kind of becoming a better person. Not that, her partner sort of changes her. That's not a healthy way to think of it, but that, it in that way of how someone can kind of make you want to be a better person, as a sort of inspiration. And so that core to that character was always going to be a part of the book. And so that was where I started. And then there's a bunch of sort of side characters and other things that come and go. And when I started doing Tori's storyline, it was much less laid out, because I kind of decided late that this was something we were going to do. There's a romantic arc in there too that I'm really happy with. I can't really talk about it because it's spoilers for book 3, but like I was pretty happy with how that worked out, because seemed real.
Yeah, the romance, I mean, this helped me come around to the idea of like what romance can do in books, because as you said, romance isn't about finding like how it can want you to be a better person. Romance isn't really about romance in these
Yeah.
kind of stories, I think, unless you're writing a romance story, which neither of us are in this case.
Yeah.
What it's about is, because we all do learn most about ourselves from how we interact with people, and especially
That,
when you're talking about young people, who you want and who you think you should want and why you want them is all, it's all very interlaced, and very it's a big part of learning about who you are. So I've come around on it, and now I think of romance as how can you learn about yourself through how you're relating to somebody else versus am I going to get the guy or am I going to get the girl, whichever the case may be, or am I going to get the person?
yeah, while it's not sort of absolutely required, you can always write a story without any element or with a character who isn't interested in that element. It feels really natural as part of a coming of age story because it is part of the coming of age for most of us, probably. Even if, you know, like, most of us don't go on epic quests or fight monsters, but most of us do, at some point interact with other people in a sort of hopeful, romantic way, and often it's painful and, or everybody learns things in this experience, and which is why we're so interested in it. In a way, it feels like I was thinking how, if you wanted to do a book with no romance in it, it's almost like that would be the adult fantasy, although maybe not. Because then you could have someone who's like, yeah, I'm over that. Did that already.
Well, just because eventually you're going to run out of variations of
Right.
interactions, and but like,
Or, I mean, I've read adult fantasies where there's no real romantic element on the page because our main character has a committed partner and they're not around in the book context. I'm an investigator and I've arrived on this distant planet and I have a wife back home and I'm going to do my thing.
but yeah, which is to say that I'm very sympathetic to the feeling of not wanting romance to be central to anybody's
Yeah.
personal arc, but it can inform it in a way, especially in young adult fiction. I mean, even if what you're learning is that you're not interested in romance, that's something that
Mm-hmm.
presumably most people have to learn about themselves.
Yeah, it's a trick because, like, as Anna was saying, if you let it dominate, then you end up in kind of a not great place where this is the only thing that's important or has value.
Well, I hate that message that that says you are nothing and no one unless somebody wants to make out with you. And I feel like
Yeah.
that is a message that I imbibed as a teenager, that I'm still contending with low these many years later. So I really didn't want to contribute to that idea because it's a trap.
Mm-hmm.
I also love that there's several instances in yours, Maxine, where it's kind of implied because she's a wench. Maybe she's been involved with a lot of people and she's always like, not that kind of girl, but like no judgment, sort of like, I love that. I love that.
If you're a tavern wench, that you're only meeting people who are going in and out of town and you're very, very busy, but occasionally you need to blow off steam, presumably.
And Django, you mentioned the bringing the Tory storyline in and how that came up kind of late. And I had because the first book is only written from one point of view. Mm-hmm. And then the second we switched to two. And as I started the second and got to the Tory, I was like, wait, what? What happened? So how did that end up coming about? Can we do that without spoilers?
It's hard. I mean, we can do it without more spoilers than are on the back of the books. Basically, in the initial layout for the series, it was going to be Isaga goes to the ghost ship Soliton and does some stuff and then eventually returns home. And she returns home to find that her sister has not been idle, but has in fact started stuff of her own during that time. And I kind of sketched that out. But when I thought about actually writing it, I was like, first of all, just too much stuff happens back at home. It'll be too different when we get there for us just not to know how it came to be. It's too much to put in a flashback. We need this point of view earlier to sort of weave this story in. But also, as I wrote Issaka's character, a thing which I hadn't initially laid out. So the idea when we meet Issaka, she's working as this sort of horrible gang enforcer, murdering people for money. And her sort of excuse for it is that she is, she and her sister lived on the streets, and she is keeping her sister in relative luxury, ignorant of the criminal side of her life. And she kind of idolizes her as this one perfect thing in her otherwise monstrous world. And I wanted to make clearer, after we finished the first book, how unhealthy this is for both of them, right? That this is not a good relationship, and it's kind of deeply messed up, and that to sort of confront some of the ways in which it's messed up, both for Issaka and for Tori. And that meant we needed a Tori point of view to see her sort of interiority on that relationship. And so when I was starting book 2, I went to my editor and I was like, I really think we need this. And she's like, yes, absolutely, do it. And so then we did it.
I love that word, interiority. We don't use it enough. So such a useful word.
Excellent.
All right. And so then kind of last thing, I guess, because we are getting close to time. I know we talked a little bit about pandemic and how that has affected you guys, but was there a point when this all started where writing became difficult, or is that something you retreated to? Because I know that's a question the attendees ask a lot.
There was definitely a point where it became difficult. I never was really blocked. In a way, after the pandemic started, it felt like I just had way less focus available to me in any given day. And I had to very carefully arrange, since I'm, as a full-time writer, this is my job, this is what pays the bills, and so I had to very carefully make sure that came first, because often after an hour or two of writing, I was just not good for anything that required real concentration for the rest of the day. That's kind of gradually improved after the summer. But yeah, I mean, especially over the summer when there were riots and then there was the election, there was just all this stuff constantly. I also had to take a big step back from social media, which I think helped a lot. I had to sort of stop reading my full Twitter feed because it was just nonstop, politics and disease. And so there's a lot of kind of mental health habits that I either learned or, had learned in the past and had to reapply this year, because it's been just a kind of a crazy time.
For me, I mean, I kept writing through it. I wouldn't vouch for the quality of anything that I wrote. But I kept writing for the same reason that I talked about before. If I'm not actively working on something, I get very anxious. And this has been, I mean, I am already a very anxious person. Like, I'm clinically anxious. And this was a very anxiety producing year. I mean, in some ways, I'm in a lot of ways, I'm hugely lucky, because I'm employed and healthy, and my family is so far not wholly unscathed. Obviously, we have lost people, but my parents are healthy. They have vaccination appointments, which I'm very excited about. Um, but I do live alone, with the cat. And in some ways, I think that helped, because I didn't have anyone else's moods to manage. When I was talking to friends who have spouses and children, and it seems like they weren't even really able to feel their
Yeah.
feelings a lot. And in some ways, I was very lucky that I was able to go full feral when I needed to sometimes. I mean, there are drawbacks to that, obviously, too, where you hit 7 o'clock at night for the sixth night in a row where you are not doing anything, and you're just like, what is time? What is other people? And you can get very, you know, you can get very weepy about it. You know, it's very emotional, and this year has brought up a lot of emotional things. But for me, writing is a habit that if I don't do it, I start to feel less like myself. So again, I wouldn't vouch for any of the quality because my focus has been, you know, this isn't I can say for shit, right? My focus has been totally for shit this year. So it's been I I'm sure I'm gonna I completed a full draft of this adult book during the pandemic, and it's a total teardown. I'm reading it now and I'm like, this is not a book. This is a disparate collection of scenes in a variety of tones. So like it affected my writing, but I kept writing because that is my own personal pathology.
Okay. And then the very last thing I always like to ask is, just in case we have any prospective authors in the audience, like very brief writing advice for people that are trying to start writing a book.
I mean,
Basically,
go ahead.
Basically what I said before, just finish something first of all. Like say you're going to finish it, and also be okay with it being terrible, because very few people in the history of the world have written a good first draft, and you cannot fix what you have not written. And that's really the best advice that I have, is that if you get it on the page, at least it exists, and you can always improve what already exists.
Yeah, I mean, the stuff we were saying earlier about process being personal is really important. You know, if you're trying to get started as a writer, the requirement is that you produce writing in some way, shape, or form. But beyond that, you sort of try different techniques and see what works for you. Maybe you're a works every day to write 1,000 words writer. Maybe you're a works every day for 15 minutes or once a week, but for 4 hours or whatever. As long as you get
writes on their phone, like while they're like when commuting was a thing, they would be on the subway and they would write on the commute on their phone, and I was like, that sounds crazy to me.
I know someone whose writing is all on like Dragon Dictate, like a speech to text thing. Or I heard that Kevin J. Anderson writes his books by just like taking long walks out in the desert with a voice recorder and just talking, and then he just like pays some minion to type it all in, which is, you know, a nice thing if you can get it. But anyway, so there's that. And I really echo what Maxine said about finishing stuff. It's really important. You know, it's really tempting. You know, you start a book and you write 50,000 words and you think, oh man, I've learned so much. This book is terrible. Why don't I just restart and do it over again? But like that can become a cycle, and then maybe you never finish something. Like you learn things by finishing a book, even if you never edit it, even if it just sits in a drawer for the rest of your life, you learn things. So, you know, don't like drive yourself to finish things if it's making you absolutely miserable, but like it's worth doing.
Move the goalposts. Like if it's making you miserable, write it in a different way.
Yeah.
You know, but if you want to write, that's all you have to do and there's no judgment on how you do that at all. I mean, some people, like for me, I can't edit while I go. I know this about myself, because if I do that, I will get in my head until it's perfect. But there are other writers who they edit as they go, but they keep on going is the point. And so it really doesn't matter how it works for you, just as long as you're like, as long as you don't give up, basically, which is kind of trite advice. But
the other thing I'd say is don't get too precious about like inspiration and feeling like brilliant. You know, novels are, if you're planning to be an author and write novels specifically, novels are marathons. They are long, and there are guaranteed to be days when you're just not feeling it. And that's okay, right? You know, my experience is that I go back and edit a novel, and I can't tell which were the days when I thought, ugh, this is terrible, and which were the ones I thought it was great. Like the great parts are not the things I thought were great when I was doing the draft, and vice versa. And so, don't, being that guy who sits down and is like, I'm just going to wait for the muse to strike me, is like, that might work if you're writing a poem or a short story that you can mash out in one session, but nobody can write a novel like that. It's going to take months and months of just work.
It's just too many words.
Yeah.
To wait for inspiration.
And so you just have to own that and accept, some days you're going to get up and you'll be like, ugh, I pulled teeth and I got to 1,000 words and that's my quota and now I'm done.
And that's okay.
Yeah, and that's fine,
All right, well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you, this was fun.
Thank you for having us, this is great.
I cannot recommend Wells of Sorcery or Wench enough. They were both really fun, really adventurous YA fantasy with strong female characters, and I adored them, and I tore through both the trilogy and standalone. I'm gonna get used to this eventually. So love them.
Video, right?
We have them all in store now, so they are available. There's a link in the chat box, and there was on your registration email also for where you can order all those books in one place. So thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Maxine and Django, for doing this with us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's so much fun.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, if you have any questions or anything we didn't get to, you can find me on Twitter, usually at Django Wexler.
Yeah, and I'm Maxine G. Kaplan.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank y'all. Everybody have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.